drugs. A word that carries quite the strong connotation. Not only do they have an immense influence, both positive and negative, on our society and way of life, but they're also something that pretty much everyone indulges in. Yes, everyone. That includes old granny and Pastor John down the road. This is because the label drugs actually just means any chemical substance that causes a change in an organism's physiology or psychology when consumed. That means alcohol, that means nicotine, in cigarettes, that means coffee. So in reality, where the line is drawn on what is considered a drug is actually far more arbitrary than you might think. There is a reason why we see drugs in this way, and this reason is responsible for substantially more harm than any good it may have caused. Today, we're talking about the war on drugs. Hey, it's Josh here from MindHeal. We're a non-commercial project with the objective of sharing the principles of harm reduction far and wide. In this video, we're going to take a comprehensive look at the war on drugs, starting with its history and working our way through its cost, influence on society, and how the public health measures put in place continue to strongly affect many today. It's safe to assume that, if you're watching this video, you've at least heard the term war on drugs before. It was a huge policy. Over $100 billion was spent in yearly costs to achieve basically nothing. And what on earth do we mean by a war on drugs? I mean, it's not like we're seeing tanks in the streets busting local dealers, or drone strikes on farms in illegal states. It hardly looks like a war. So what is the war on drugs exactly? Well, to gain a proper understanding, we'll first have to take a look into the past and work our way forward. We'll also be focusing primarily on the United States, given that they acted as somewhat of a forceful trendsetter here, encouraging many of their allies to follow suit. As far back as the 1700s, records of efforts that would eventually mutate into the war on drugs can be found, initially focusing on alcohol. These restrictive efforts saw their focus and intensity fluctuate over the years, shifting over to caffeine, and then to things such as morphine, heroin, and cocaine, and then shortly after including opium. This came during the Prohibition era and led to a stronger stance on these topics and greater inclusion and influence upon public sentiment, which then led to an even stronger, more widely encompassing set of policies and restrictions. This came to include amphetamines, shortly after, heroin, marijuana, and PCP after that, which was also largely cracked down on by a desire to suppress anti-war sentiment due to the ongoing conflict in Vietnam at the time. At this point, the war on drugs had technically begun. The DEA, or Drug Enforcement Agency, is established, and shortly after, so is the Bureau of the US Department of State for International Drug Affairs. An extradition treaty is even signed with Colombia, the world's largest cocaine exporter. It wasn't until a decade later, however, that things truly spiraled. In 1981, the pharmacological revolution, constituting a complete crackdown on substance use, comes into play. Ronald Reagan expands upon the war on drugs, instating strict law enforcement and increased penalties, while also vastly extending the list of controlled substances. Marijuana, heroin, crack, Valium, OxyContin, Prozac, Xanax, Ritalin, Adderall, Viagra, and even steroids. All of these substances saw the incorporation of life-altering penalties for even personal possession. Now, the history of the war on drugs is a long one, but for this video, we'll be sticking to how individuals have been affected by it. There are an extreme array of other economical, geopolitical, and domestic consequences, but we just don't have time to get into them. So let's start with the bad news first, taking a look at the cons. Remember how I just said that we would avoid geopolitics? Well, we won't dive in, but we will have to dip our toe into the pond, because one major con from the war on drugs is the crack cocaine epidemic throughout the late 20th century America. With unstable cocaine markets in the US and the CIA looking for some off-the-books funding for operations in South America, Los Angeles streets were suddenly flooded with this relatively new, cheap, insanely addictive cocaine derivative, which rapidly found its way across the United States. This drug is a direct result of the war on drugs, since market conditions for cocaine would have been stable without a war on drugs, and the CIA wouldn't have needed funding if they weren't engaged in the war on drugs. Both the demand and supply of crack cocaine arose out of conditions that this war had created. Next off, we have incarceration rates. Cases of drug-related arrests and convictions of adults in the United States have more than quadrupled since the initial instatement of the war on drugs. This has two direct effects. The lives of those incarcerated are forever changed, and statistically, the majority find themselves forced back into a life of crime by a system that refuses to reintegrate them once they are released, if they are even released at all. Which segues into point B. What do you think a quadrupling of incarcerations does to the prison system? It saturates it, which subsequently leads to a bloated budget and, sadly, improper distribution of funds, leaving penitentiaries unequipped to handle the huge number of prisoners. Even worse, it has led to for-profit prisons, which themselves engage in wildly unethical practices, such as borderline slave labour, and even bribery in order to extend inmates' sentences, lest they lose their contracts. The list of cons goes on, although the others are somewhat self-explanatory. Criminalisation of a mental and public health issue, as we've mentioned in our harm reduction related videos. Stunting of scientific research through substance-related restrictions. Increase in danger surrounding substances as a whole, thanks to lack and regulation and unmoderated markets. Absurd expenditure of tax funds better spent elsewhere. There is an attempt being made to avoid one-sidedness, but the numbers tell a rather one-sided story. In that effort towards fairness though, we'll highlight the one pro of all of this, although whether this is a positive or negative is actually quite subjective and dependent on your political opinions. Thanks to the war on drugs and the efforts required to fight it, agencies such as the DEA and for-profit prisons have flourished. This has led to greater funding of local law enforcement and a mass creation of jobs in the sector over the past half-decade. Most of these jobs employ middle-class citizens, providing a stable income for many and propping up smaller communities around the country, as well as allowing these private prison facilities to lighten the load on state-run ones, which has demonstrably improved the circumstances of tens of thousands of inmates across the country. Many would argue that these benefits are a temporary, disproportionately small gain compared to the greater negative impact on the world as a whole, from an individual level all the way up to the global scene. We're not looking to instill an opinion, however, but rather present information with which you can form your own. So there we have it. It's a heavy topic, to say at least. So please make sure to use what you've learned in this video as an introduction to the subject, through which you can continue to learn and develop your knowledge and stance on the topic. We've covered the core aspects, but there's still much more to inform oneself about, and we highly encourage you to do so. If you're interested in that, we'd really recommend heading over to our website for further information on the war on drugs, from its history to greater detail on its impact within the US, as well as the rest of the world. We're also introducing a new chatbot based on the hyped ChatGPT, so that you can have real-time conversations about staying safe and get personalized advice on any questions or concerns that you may have. I've been Josh, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.